My name is Andrei Pop, and I'm a professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. And I'd like to tell you about my book, A Forest of Symbols. Now, I'm an art historian by training, but I'm equally interested in the history of science and of philosophy. What is A Forest of Symbols about? I was initially struck by a coincidence. This word, symbolism, which is the name of an artistic movement, roughly between Impressionism and Cubism, of artists and poets who turn their back on external reality to explore the inner world, meant something completely different to mathematicians and logicians. Basically, to them, it meant the very figures, the symbols with which they made their arguments and which changed radically around the same time, around 1900. So I asked myself, is this really a coincidence, or is there a deeper connection? And that deeper connection would have to be in the very term, the idea of the symbol itself. Now, most generally, a symbol is something standing for something else. The logo on my t-shirt, but also the cut of my jacket, are symbolic, probably. So are all the covers of all the books in this room, but also all of their contents. In a way, we're surrounded by symbols, the way a forest surrounds its inhabitants. This is a metaphor due to the French poet Charles Baudelaire, who in a way inaugurated the movement. So, if symbols are everywhere, what defines a symbolist? I focus on writers and artists that are just as interested in how their symbols work as what they stand for. So, a painter who thinks about how perspective implies a spectator, or a mathematician who wants every step in a deduction to be reflected in a diagram. This blows right open the canon of who is a symbolist. Besides familiar figures like Odilon Redon or Edvard Munch, who are in my book, there is also the weird writer Edgar Allan Poe, or the great Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. Besides the American impressionist Mary Cassatt, there is Ουίλλιαμ Τζέιμς, the great pragmatist philosopher-scientist. What brings them all together is the quest to make the private public by analyzing the very tools and means that shuttle between those two realms. There is a reason all this was happening at the end of the 19th century, a time of rapid industrialization driven by imperialism, but also an individualistic, skeptical time shaken by the Darwinian theory of evolution. Darwin himself put the dilemma well. Can we trust the ideas that form in the head of a monkey that only helped it in its struggle for survival? If we can't, then truth remains eternally out of reach, despite our trains and telegraphs. There were different responses to this dilemma, but perhaps the most interesting was the revival of a Platonism that insisted that not all truths depend on human cognition. In the words of the great mathematician Frege, who is one of the heroes of this book, one discovers a number or a law of physics the same way one discovers a mountain range. Now think about what that means. The name we give it, the way we represent it, may be arbitrary and differ from one language to another, but the thing, the mountain or the number, is there nevertheless. If that sounds odd, think how odd the evolutionist view would be that the sum 1 + 1 is 2 evolved as hominids evolved in Africa and might someday evolve to something different, like 1 + 1 = 3. What did artists have to contribute to this development? Well, they contributed the very means by which abstract objects, from numbers to states of mind, could be symbolized, whether that be in monochrome painting or program music or free verse. What artists could bring to the table was the very possibility of representing to the senses the abstract, invisible part of reality. So the rise of abstractness in painting or in music or free verse corresponds in my story with calculation with infinite numbers. the development of relativity theory, the invention of artificial languages, and later programming languages. What all of these movements needed were concrete ways to convey their discoveries to the world, and that work was a work on and with symbols. If symbolism is so important, why don't we talk about it? Well, avant-garde movements usually have a half-life of about 5 to 10 years, after which the members fight, splinter, and come up with new names for their new groups. Some of the groups that followed symbolism became quite well known, such as Cubism and Expressionism, but their splitting, of course, obscures their shared roots in symbolism. Another larger, more broad category, modernism, also came in a way to take the place of symbolism. Artists who were thought of as symbolists as late as the Second World War, like Joyce and Eliot, Kafka and Kavafis, came to be known as modernists, a name that certainly honors their forward-lookingness, but not, I think, their interest in the very means by which they changed the art of the past. That said, the name isn't everything. Much of the multimedia art of the last century could be called symbolist, and not just ambitious masterpieces like 2001 or Sgt. Pepper's, but such recent entertainment as the television series Squid Game, which overlays a satire of capitalist competitiveness on the folkloric structure of Korean children's games. Or the video game Super Mario Odyssey, a 3D world in which players meet at every step the previous look and feel of two-dimensional early Mario games, and is as much a reflection on the means of making interactive games as an invitation to inhabit their world, and for that reason deserves to be called symbolist. Who is this book for? I envision 3 constituencies of readers. Art lovers who want to know how we got from the 19th century's photographic realism to the 20th century's blank canvases may find in symbolism the missing link, an art movement as interested in the matter as in the meaning of art. Readers interested in science are going to find the same transition between the 19th century Victorian science, fixated on the empirical, and the visionary 20th century science of Einstein and quantum mechanics. What's interesting here is how scientists at their most aesthetically creative were also their most rational. This brings me to my 3rd constituency, readers interested in the future of the humanities, something that has to do both with reason and the imagination. Now, it's no secret that in recent years, populist politicians have borrowed some of the rhetoric of literary theory, reducing truth to conflicting interpretations or to incompatible sets of alternate facts. The solution to this proposed by symbolism is not to insist dogmatically that we all have access to the same reality, but to show how, starting from our own limited subjective points of view, making our own limited representations, we can aim beyond them at truths that transcend them, seeing as it were both the forest and the trees that compose it.